Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on Behind the Headlines. I'm Shoshanna Solomon. I'm the Innovations and Economics reporter for the Times of Israel. And joining us today in the conversation is Dr. Nadine Baudot-Trajtenberg, a former deputy governor of the Bank of Israel. Nadine was born in Canada. She has an MA in philosophy, politics and economics from the University of Oxford, and a PhD in economics from Harvard University. In 1985, lucky for us, she immigrated to Israel and has held numerous positions as a lecturer in universities. And in 2014, she joined the Bank of Israel as deputy governor, a position she held till 2019. And for 2 months in this period, she was actually acting governor. Nadine is an important and dominant voice in Israel's economic scene, and she is considered a leading voice in international and economics and banking. Nadine, thank you for joining us today and sharing with us and talking to us about the economic crisis that's shaking the world and shaking Israel, and giving us a little bit of insights on why this crisis is so much more devastating and so much more unique than others. And I hope you're doing well in these crazy times.
Yeah, thank you. But you're right. I mean, you just mentioned that this is such a unique crisis, and financial crises and crises of all kinds we've seen in many countries over the decades, over the centuries even. But this crisis is truly unique. When I think about it, first of all, the sheer size of the crisis. We've never seen anything like it. And if you look at the Israeli economy, and I think on the graph that we can put up, you can see that. I mean, Israel has seen many shocks over its life. If you look here, we see, annual GDP growth for Israel since, the early 60s. And you see, we've had some good years and bad years. But if I were to ask you, think of the big shocks, particularly because of conflicts that Israel has seen. Think of the 67 war, the 73, the Yom Kippur War, 1973, or, the Second Intifada. You can barely see it on the graph because of the scale of the drop in GDP that we're about to see in 2020. And by the way, the drop that we see there is in fact a relatively moderate drop, meaning by that these were the sort of a lower end of the estimates. In fact, the estimates today are probably of a bigger drop than that. So, and what we're seeing here for Israel is true for all of the countries in the world. So just the massive, in a sense, there's almost no way to exaggerate the size of this shock. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect, which is quite unique, is that it is a shock which is directly to the real economy. Most crises that we've seen, over the past decades, have often been financial crises, certainly true 10, 12 years ago, the global financial crises, or think of the many crises in South American countries or some other countries. Very often it starts as a financial crisis, which has a ripple onto the economy. This time around, it's directly the real economy that is hit. And that's a very unusual type of crisis. Now, and it's even more unusual than that because it is both a supply shock and a demand shock at the same time. So it's a supply shock the same way we think of a big earthquake, for instance, in a country, or a tsunami in Japan, remember, or Indonesia, impacts on the economy. So that's a supply shock because part of your productive capacity gets destroyed. And here, part of our productive capacity was destroyed because we closed the skies, we closed certain economic activities, we stopped people from going to work. So clearly the amount that we can produce has been at least temporarily destroyed. So that's a supply shock. But we've never seen a supply shock of that magnitude. But it's also a demand shock at the same time. And it's a demand shock because people, a large part now of the workforce, and in Israel, we're talking about now more than 20% of people are unemployed. So their income has dropped dramatically. There's also a huge amount of uncertainty as to how long are we going to be in this situation. You see, when you have an earthquake, it's dramatic, it destroys part of the infrastructure, but the minute it's over, it's over. Then you rebuild. Now we're in this very uncertain environment. We don't know how long we're going to be in there. And therefore, firms are not going to rapidly expand. They will probably stop their investment. Us as consumers, we're probably more careful about our spending. We may have a job now. We don't know if tomorrow we'll have a job. So there's a lot of uncertainty. And in part also, the amount we can buy was also limited because of some activities have been closed. So we can't really go to restaurants very much, and we can't go to bars, and weddings, big weddings are not, occurring, and so on and so forth. So these are, that's a very unusual shock. It's huge. It hits both the demand and the supply.
It's global.
It doesn't.
And it's global.
And it's global. So again, there's almost, no words that could exaggerate the size of this crisis.
Wow. Now, Israel entered this crisis in a pretty good shape economically. We had like 3% growth. Unemployment was at record low levels of below 4% before Corona, and our debt to GDP ratio was around 60, which was better than many other developed countries. The coronavirus has shuffled everything, and now we are talking about unemployment depends on whose figures you look at, but between 12% to 21%, if you take the CBE, the Statistical Bureau, the Employment Service. We are talking about the first time the economy will contract since 2002, I believe. And as you said, it's going to be the good scenario is a contraction of 6%, whereas the worst scenarios could be 8% or even more. And debt to GDP ratio is going to be apparently over 70%, 76%, something like that. Now, what are unique problems, economic problems that are unique to Israel in dealing with this crisis?
I mean, to a certain extent, as in all crises, it emphasizes our strength and our weaknesses. So this crisis, our strength, and you've just mentioned a few of the good points of our strength, is that we are entering this crisis at a time where we had fairly solid economic fundamentals. So we were lucky enough not to go through the global financial crisis that many of the other advanced economies went through. So we start this crisis in relatively good position. We were not too heavily indebted, so we have some fiscal space. We had good ratings by international agencies. We have a current account surplus, meaning by that, we're very much dependent on trade, but we're fairly diversified in terms of to whom we sell, from whom we buy, and so on. So these are good, it's a good place to, if you're going to hit a crisis, it's a good place to start. And it also has emphasized some of the micro elements at which we're very good. And this we can see that, I think, if we look, despite all the criticism about the response, the medical response to the actual problem, which is, of course, the coronavirus and the COVID-19, if you look at the mortality rates in Israel, they're still relatively low. They're not the lowest in the world, but they're quite low. And I think that shows, again, the strength, in a sense, of the Israeli population, of how we really put in extra effort, and in the health sector, people have put in extra effort, indeed, to try to save as many lives as possible. So it has emphasized, our strength, but it is also, and it is also starting to emphasize our big weaknesses. And here, I should say two things. I mentioned how, how unique this crisis is. And it is also, but it's important now, if we sort of take this crisis a little bit more deeply, it's a very unequal crisis, okay? The entire country is being hit. And yet, if you look at who economically is being hit, it is very unequal. And I think I have a slide here that shows that. Is that if you look at the people who have lost their jobs, either because they're, they literally have lost a job completely, or they have been put on leave without pay, it's a huge number of people. Okay, initially 1 million people, now we're at about 875,000 people. If you look at those who have been hit, they tend to be people who were at the lowest end of the economic, socioeconomic scale. So if the average wage in Israel is about 10,500 shekels a month, if you look at those who've lost their job, their earning is closer to 6,500 shekels a month. And even if you look, so it's specific sectors have been hit, and these sectors are characterized by lower income. But even in the sectors that have high wages, if you look at those who have lost their jobs, there are also people who have much lower than average wages. So if you look, for instance, in the ICT sector, the average wage there is a lot higher than the average wage in Israel. It's about 23,000 shekels a month. But if you look at those in the sectors who've lost their job, their average wage is only 11,000.
Is this a global trend as well, or is this just?
This is absolutely global. If you look in every country, this shock has been a very uneven shock. And those people who have been hurt the most are people who were naturally the weakest in a sense of the economy. And they have, who can work from home very often tend to be, of course, people who work in field where technical skills are in demand, and these technical skills, of course, earn higher wages. So that's true in Israel, and it's been true across the board. Now, and I said, so that's a problem for all countries, but we happen to be a country that it is one of our weaknesses. Amongst the developed countries, we have one of the most unequal distribution of income, and we have a large share of people who are, in fact, below the level of poverty. So we already suffer from this. And in addition, this very large shock is hitting exactly the weakest in the society. Now, it didn't have to be like that. I mean, when you think of, for instance, the dot-com bubble bust, it didn't particularly hit the sectors that had, people lower income. In fact, it was the other way around. It had tended to. So not all crises are unequal the way this crisis is. So it's a very unequal crisis, and we happen to suffer already from greater inequality. So this is, I think, and it is therefore a much, I think, bigger challenge than for other countries. So that's one, I think, one of the major problems that we're going to have to be facing when we think in terms of policy. So some of our policies have to be similar to other places, but some of the policies have to address also where we were the weakest, and therefore how we should correct.
Do you think the government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has announced a number of packages, like rescue packages, like 100 billion shekels for the economy in packages, and also now a 6 billion handout to Israelis that has been much criticized. So is the government managing to address the needs, and then basically what are they doing right, what are they doing wrong, and why are our streets roiling with protest? Why are people taking to the streets and saying that the government is completely disconnected?
I think there's a few elements to all of these things. First of all, we are already, there was the immediate shock. Remember the immediate shock? We're already talking a few months ago. Nobody knew how long it was going to last. There were, at the time, I think many people thought, okay, this is clearly a very large shock, but perhaps in the summer, the virus is going to go away and we'll be able to go back to where we are. So there was an immediate response. If you want a very short term, think of it of a survival package. Countries move very, very fast there. If you look at European countries, you look at the United States, countries move very fast. They saw a very large shock. They thought at the time, I think, nobody knew how long it was going to last, but clearly you needed a survival kit. In Israel, we had almost no survival kit. Remember, we were in an in-between. The government was not yet formed. We were still in a transition government. There was no economic leadership. So the immediate response was very weak compared to what we saw in other countries. Now we're at a second stage. Now, clearly, I think all policymakers around the world understand that this is going to be a longer shock. It will take longer to recover. So now we have to think of, okay, which policies are appropriate for a longer term? And in fact, the response that we saw just recently is more like a survival response, and not, this is in a sense perhaps what should have been done 4 months ago. Now we're at a different stage, and at the different stage, when you think of a longer type of policy, you need to ensure, and now we know the economy is not going to go back to where it was. There are some areas, some sectors that will not recover for years. When you think of the tourism sector, it will take years before it recovers. The transportation sector. So it also means that there are some region Israel, think of Eilat, which is very much a tourist type of place. It will take a long time before it recovers. So once you know that the economy will have in part to transform. So the types of policies have to allow flexibility. You need support, but you also need flexibility, to leave flexibility. So the second response should have been the first. And so there's great disappointment in there. And let me give you the example, the response to give a fixed amount to basically everyone. I just mentioned, not everyone's been hit the same. Right. This is a very unequal type of shock. Okay, so you should give more to those who have been hit. There are others who have not been hit. So again, the response was did not take that into account at all.
But what's going on then? Why is that? Is the government not getting enough advice, or do you have any insight on how the decisions are being made? I mean, are you on the phone with colleagues who are advising? Are you advising?
Let me mention two other things that I think are part of the reason why there's such great disappointment. Yeah. So I mentioned, okay, so we start this crisis, we don't have a government, okay? Now, when you are into a crisis, the element of trust is enormously important. Do you trust that your leaders are taking, and they have to take very difficult decisions. I don't want to diminish the difficulty in taking these decisions, both in terms of how to handle the health crisis and how to handle the economic crisis. So because these are difficult decisions and they're asking of the entire population to make a very big effort, these decisions have a huge impact on our lives, on everybody's lives. So the amount of trust that you have in the government is extremely important. And from the start, okay, so we didn't really have a government. Then finally, there's a government that appears. From the start, every signal that we had was a signal that reduced our trust. okay, to start with a huge government, okay, of 34 million. We know we're going to have financial problems, okay? So we start with a huge number of ministers. Second, we deal with issues that are completely unrelated to this huge crisis. And I told you, this is the biggest crisis we've ever seen. And the attention of the government was on other things. The Finance Committee spends 3 hours discussing whether we should reimburse the Prime Minister for his expenses on his private residence. The 3 hours discussion displaced what other discussion was supposed to take place? Payments to single parents. The committee did not have time to discuss that because it spent 3 hours on that. So all of these elements are extremely, extremely destabilizing. You need, the government is asking us to make very large efforts. We can't send kids to school. We have to lock down. We couldn't even do the holidays that we normally do holidays. We can't go to bars. We can't do this. So we're all making a big effort, and many of us also are losing their jobs and their income. And you have a sense that these important discussions are not taking place. So I think there was an erosion of trust very early on. And economic activity in general requires trust. So this erosion of trust, I think, will turn out to be very painful economically.
Is there any easy way to restore this trust, do you think?
It's not going to be easy. And one of the things that is, I think, perhaps not helping, and hopefully it can be corrected. I mentioned that, we need support. And you mentioned, Nadine, that the government has announced fiscal support and loans and so on. And we start with, we do have fiscal space. We are, in fact, in fairly good position. Yes, we can afford to have a large government deficit this year. We can afford to increase the burden of debt, but not indefinitely. Okay. And I think that one of the feeling that we're having is that there's a free lunch out there. We can spend on anything, and we can spend very large amounts. That's not true. Mm-hmm. It is never true. So you want to have the feeling that the government is going to make difficult decisions, not easy decision. It's an easy decision to give money to everybody. That does not restore trust. You restore trust if you show that, yes, you are making difficult decisions. You are confronting the various interests who come and all want money. Right. And so I think that's one of the most important things. In fact, I would want to see a finance minister that says no, not a finance minister that says yes to everything. That is not restoring my trust in the system.
Right. Tell me, is there any country in the world who's actually doing something right?
Well, again, as I mentioned, most countries have reacted fairly quickly with large fiscal packages and also with very strong monetary stimulus. And Israel has also responded with, I think, the appropriate monetary stimulus. So I think that this has been a good monetary response in Israel. The countries that seem to be doing quite well are also countries that increase trust in the government. And we've seen that, of course, in New Zealand, and we've seen this in Germany, in Denmark. I mean, these are countries that took very difficult decisions very early on, and that, in fact, has gained the trust of their citizens, as opposed to promising that things will get better soon, as we've seen in some other countries. So I think that the gaining of the trust was very important, and it will leave them more space to take difficult decisions, because they will also have to make difficult decisions.
This crisis is reshuffling our lives and reshuffling everything we know about economies. So do you think there's some trends that existed pre-coronavirus in the economy that will disappear, and there will be new trends that now we need to get used to? What's your thoughts on that?
I mean, there's at the global level and there's at the individual level of our economy. Of course, again, as all crises, it tends to, emphasize our strength and emphasize our weaknesses. I think in this case, it will accelerate some of the processes that we have seen. As in many countries, we've had two economies. We've had a high-tech sector where wages are very high and very productive sector. And on the other hand, we have traditional sectors that are inefficient, bureaucratic, where wages are low. This tension between these two economies characterizes pretty much all economies around the world. But in Israel, again, it's more extreme. Our high-tech sector is particularly productive with particularly high wage. And our traditional sector is particularly unproductive with low wage, which is why we have such an unequal distribution of income. And then comes this COVID-19, where the reorganization of work is requiring people in part to work from home. You have to have an economy, you have to have your industries that are able to make these adjustments. So I think it will, and as I mentioned, some of the industries will probably not recover for quite a while. So we have to ensure, and there's two big sectors that are that are part of the public sector that will need to be transformed and will need to grow as a proportion of the economy. Clearly the health sector. We had come towards the end of, I would say, what we could get out of the expenses that we put on health. Clearly, we've gotten to the end, and we will need more health as a product, as a service, and we will need to put more resources in there and to make it more efficient. Similarly, in education, particularly education of younger children, because if we have to operate for a while with smaller classes or with capsule, the words that we're saying, so splitting these classes, and if we need kids in part to be able to study from home, we'll need to have more resources. So that's what I mean, that the need to make these difficult decisions. And here we see on the graph, indeed, that in Israel, because of this unequal distribution of income, in order for kids to be able to study from home, they need two things. They need, of course, to have access to a computer, but they also need a quiet environment so that they can study. And if you look at who has access to both a computer and a quiet environment, in fact, you can find that in some part of the society, particularly in the Arab sector and the ultra-Orthodox sector, there are very few of these kids have access to that. So that's going to be a big challenge. And when we talk about education in school, I want to remind some of the basic elements of Israel, which is really, really different from any other economy I can think about. And I can see this if we look at the next slide. We have a combination in Israel of two very positive things, but not seen anywhere else. We have a very high labor rate participation of women. In Israel, women are in the labor force. If you see the blue line there, Israel is substantially above the average OECD country. It's way above the United States, okay? So we have women in Israel work in the labor force. But if you look at the table on the right-hand side, the fertility rate, this is the average number of children per woman in Israel. We are a complete outlier compared to any other countries I can think of. Okay, advanced economies on average have a fertility rate of about 1.5, with the lowest in Japan and Korea, they're barely at 1. And by the way, if you are below 2.1, it means you have a shrinking population unless you have immigrants. Okay, so if you're below 2.1, all of these countries would see shrinking population if it weren't for the immigrants who are arriving there. So, and that is the case for almost all OECD countries. Israel's fertility rate, by the way, is substantially higher than countries like Bangladesh. So even compared to developing countries, we have a high fertility rate. So the combination of women working and people having children, the whole issue of how can you continue educating these children while women are supposed to be working, if part of it has to be in smaller classes, if it has to be remote learning, the redesign of that will require resources.
Right, right, right. Interesting, interesting. Tell me, there's talk about the vaccinations, and hopefully we will have a vaccination, not Israel maybe, but somewhere in the world there will be. So I'm wondering whether we should leave, once there is a vaccination available or more than one available, should it be market forces that are distributing the vaccination, or should we have a special model, economic model and framework in place that make sure that everybody can have access, not countries hogging it or rich countries getting it and the poor countries not? I mean, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah. I mean, vaccination in general is really what we think of as a pure public good, in that you're consuming a vaccine has an impact on you because it protects you, but it also protects the people around you. And therefore, in that, in those type of products and services, when there's positive externalities, typically the market doesn't allocate appropriately. So for vaccine, you absolutely have to have, in fact, a government-led vaccination.
Is there already such a system? Is that what happens with vaccinations today? I'm not sure.
Yes, it is. I mean, and vaccinations are taking place in schools and absolutely. So it absolutely has to be the case. You cannot let that to market forces. Otherwise, you'll have too few people being vaccinated. So that's absolutely crucial.
Okay, good. So listen, I want to get onto a little bit on the personal basis a little bit. One is, are you advising the government or advising the Bank of Israel, even if you're not, even if you're not maybe there at the moment? And secondly, how was it to be in this leading position as deputy governor? I mean, did you wake up every morning and say, oh, hell, I've got a huge responsibility on my shoulders? Or was it like going to work like a job?
So I'll start with the second question. It's a lot more fun. It is not like any other job. It's not like any other job, but I mean, for an economist, and for an economist who wants to have to have an impact on the economy, for someone who wants to be a policymaker, this was the absolutely best job in the world. You touch on every topic. Of course, there's a huge responsibility that goes with it, but you work with wonderful people, the team there, the quality of the people there, the focus on wanting to do the right thing. Is something just remarkable. So yes, it's of course very exacting in terms of time, in terms of energy, in terms of what else you have to give up. But it's a bit like a kid getting into a candy store.
Wow, amazing. So. And tell me, I know this is probably on the mind of everybody, so I have to ask this question. What are you doing with your savings? Any advice to people on how they can protect themselves in this madness that's happening?
I'm not going to make this specific investment advice, but I agree that, what we've seen is a massive drop in the stock market and suddenly a massive increase in the stock market. Interest rates are at zero and will be at zero apparently for very long term. It's a very unsettling indeed situation. What are we supposed to do with our money. I think in general, in these very uncertain times, and they will be uncertain for quite a while. It will take a while before we know exactly what else is going to be. We should not commit to large, particularly large expenses for which we don't already have the savings. I mean, I would say just prudence is a very important thing. The second thing, because it's so unclear what will happen, then one should be as diversified as possible. You would have asked anybody 4 months ago, will the market jump by 30% over the next 3 months? And nobody would have been able to say something like that. I mean, we could see we know the prices of assets are very high. Are they going to drop? Are they going to drop quickly? Will they rise again? It's so difficult to know that diversification is extremely important, and also horizon. Okay, so if you have time, if you know that you won't need, your spending immediately, then don't make quick decisions, large decisions.
Right.
So that would be my basic, in a sense, common sense type of advice, because I don't think anybody has a crystal ball for the moment.
But do you think in the end, all in all, I mean, are we going to be okay? I mean, are we going to recover? How long is it going to be? And in the end, I know you mentioned that the weaker populations are hurt. So are they going to be the main victims of this? I mean, who's going to be in the air? If you look back 10 years from now,
I mean, there was always losers and winners in these things. I think that if we make the right policies, we can have lots of winners. Okay, we have two big sectors. Now we're suffering because people are unemployed, right? People are unemployed. People are seeing their wages drop dramatically. There are two obvious sectors that needs resources. I mentioned education and health. And we don't need only teachers, and we don't need only doctors. These are big sectors. We will have to work differently. There will be plenty of employment there, but we need to have policies that will allow for more spending there, for retraining lots of people so that indeed they can leave the industries they were in and they can move into those industries. So that, it's not like there's no future. There is a future. It's just that it's accelerating, and things that, similarly, all the digital world and the, efficiency gains that we can get from that, it will have to accelerate. So that we will be okay in the sense that, yes, there will be an economy, yes, there will be jobs, but in order to get there, we should help with the policies that will help us make that transformation. Another very big transformation, and that's why I also mentioned that we should be wary of just spending too much money everywhere. No, there's no such thing as a free lunch. At some point, we'll have to pay for these things. So we should make difficult decisions. And yes, we should spend, but not freely on everything. The second thing I wanted to mention, because the entire world is going through that, and some countries are being hit more than others, what was already a trend that we could see for the past 20 years, the rise of China and the weakening, particularly of the United States, I think this crisis is also accelerating that process. Wow. And this will leave us not only with a domestic uncertainty, but also with a global uncertainty as to, where the global economy is going to be going.
Wow.
So it's going to be different. It's not going to be the same.
So the whole idea is to make lemonade out of lemons.
Absolutely. So we need flexibility, and we need to be able to say no as well.
Right. Okay. Nadine, thank you so much for your time. It was fascinating. And I'm sure we'll speak again.
Okay. Thank you, Shoshanna.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.